Welcome to this new episode of Coffee and Politics. Last week, in an unprecedented move, Twitter suspended President Trump's Twitter account indefinitely, sparking a debate about social media's role in politics. Today, my guest is an expert on just that topic, host of the podcast Social Media and Politics, and professor at Lund University, Michael Bossetta. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
So last week, President Trump's Twitter account was suspended. Now the President of the United States is not present on Twitter. You, as an academic who researches social media and politics, the way they influence each other, good move, bad move on Twitter's part?
Good move or bad move? I really don't like making those kind of like normative assessments. But what I would say is that it really shows how these platforms are the sort of arbiters of what type of content is on their platform. And as sort of private enterprises, I think it's really up to them to decide what type of actors are allowed on the platform, what type of content is allowed, and also how that content is moderated, filtered, and shared. So I think it really shows a flex both on the part of Facebook and Twitter to show that they are in control and they can shut down any actor they deem fit by any measure they seem fit. And so there's a couple interesting things about this particular ban, which is it also happened on Facebook too, but in a little bit of a different way. And we don't know whether Facebook will keep that ban indefinite or only until Trump leaves office. Because right now you can still go and see Trump's posts on Facebook, but not Twitter. But what I think is really interesting, more so than the Twitter ban, which is probably more consequential for Trump, but I do think the Facebook ban is a bit more interesting because Facebook had set up this oversight board, which a lot of people were calling Facebook's Supreme Court, right? And if you go to their website, which I did today, on the front page, it says that the oversight board was created to help Facebook answer some of the most difficult questions around freedom of expression online. What to take down, what to leave up, and why. So this seems like a perfect test case to bring in the oversight board, and it doesn't seem that they were consulted. So in a sense, not only does Facebook and Twitter not really have a sort of mandate for how they deal with these controversial questions, but actually Facebook, who has a policy and protocol in place for these types of questions, didn't even seem to use it and just went ahead and banned Trump. So I think it shows really the power that these platforms have over their own services.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think this came much too late? I remember reading an FT article on the noon of the election where they said that Facebook is now trying to figure out a strategy of what to do in case there are debates over who won the election on election night and how to combat misinformation. And then I think to myself, we've had 4 years to prepare for this. Trump said that he's going to contest the election results, and Facebook is trying to figure this out now. You've done a lot of research on Facebook, them acting as political actors themselves. Do you have any ideas about why this comes so late? Is it just not profitable for them and that's why there's no incentive?
Well, I think there's an interesting thought experiment, which is what if Trump were to have a second term? So we probably wouldn't have the election fraud contest, but would Facebook or Twitter ever ban Trump if he had a second term in office? I don't know that they would. I mean, these bans come at a time, obviously they're in response to the events at the Capitol, but they're also coming at a time when Trump is 2 weeks away from leaving office and we're having a switch to a Democratic controlled House, executive branch, and Senate. So this is, I think, from a political standpoint, this is getting in the good graces of the incoming Democratic administration, which is generally skeptical of tech as a sort of goodwill move. I mean, what else? How else can you interpret it? How else could it be? So I think that what is the limit for Facebook and Twitter to ban Trump if Trump was to be in power for 4 more years, I think would not be at this threshold. So I think that's just an interesting thing to think about, that clearly there's a new administration coming in. They have full run of the 3 branches of government. So it's both in Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg's interest to be in the good graces of that incoming administration.
So not only did they wait the full 4 years of Trump's term, they might not even have ever done it if there were another 4 years.
I
They're sort of
mean,
just watching out for themselves in a way.
who's to say? But I think a lot of people, I think, view these platforms as kind of responsive. And I think that they are responsive to controversy when they're not so responsive. They seem responsive when it works in their favor, but they're actually very, very strategic. Going back to deciding to call themselves platforms to move in between different legal and policy regimes. So yeah, my personal guess is that if it wasn't around election fraud, but something similar happened at the Capitol, there would probably be different measures rather than an outright ban if Trump was to be president, or perhaps even if the Senate wasn't to be fully controlled by Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting that this happened the same day that we found out that we would have
Georgia.
or that the two Senate races in Georgia. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
What happened if what if that outcome was different and the same tweet was sent? Would there be a ban? I think the chances are less likely.
Okay, interesting thought. I mean, you just mentioned that the platforms are largely reactionary and do things that are largely symbolic to show that they're doing something. For instance, when they would mark Trump's tweets as being inaccurate or needing of fact checking. Did this help in any way? Is there any research that shows that this stopped the spread of disinformation, or people just clicked past it and shared it anyway?
Not yet that I know of. And so the thing with academia is that it's very slow. Mm-hmm. And tech platforms move very fast. Hard to get a sense of, for this particular case, what did the flagging affect in terms of people's opinions or their behavior? What I think research tends to show, both from academia and also from what the platforms have said themselves, is that when there is misinformation, there is generally a huge correction from the public. So if we think about the Russian internet agency, the sort of troll farm that was spreading disinformation, Twitter mentioned early on in their sort of Senate hearings that for every tweet that was about being able to vote by text, which is obviously not possible, there was 8 tweets correcting that misinformation. And we do know that if correction is quick and it's visible and it comes from a reputable source, that it tends to do a pretty good job at correcting that disinformation. So I think for all of Trump's tweets of election frauds, there is a massive correction by other users of social media and also the mainstream media correcting this. And then the interesting part there that academic research can contribute to is, what do people then choose to believe? Because there's a lot of research that shows that people exhibit what's called partisan motivated reasoning, which is they tend to believe the news that align with their political opinions. So in that sense, one could argue that a Trump supporter who sees a label on Trump's claims of election fraud is going to believe Trump anyway, because it fits their pre-existing beliefs. So there's a lot to untangle there, but I think the massive amount of people who try to correct mis or disinformation is typically kind of left out of reports about disinformation. And also, people are going to believe what they want to believe anyways, based on what aligns with their opinions. That's what the research tends to suggest.
But according to that logic, it would sort of just be a free information free-for-all, where we hope that there are just enough people correcting things that we can let it be a free jungle. Everyone can tweet misinformation if they want. We just assume there will be more people tweeting accurate things. Is that a viable way to deal with this going forward, if Twitter becomes even bigger?
Well, I think the research shows that source matters and visibility matters. And particularly for source, it's the trust in that source. So if there is a sort of visible correction from a news outlet that someone distrusts, it's not going to have an effect. But looking at differences between Twitter and Facebook, you have to think about, how is the platform designed? How does it actually show corrections. So if you take a Facebook post and the first kind of top comment to that claim of election fraud is like a highly trusted nonpartisan organization, it will work. But on Twitter, it's pretty hard to see that top comment, right? You have to click to open the replies, and then you get this stream of just people being for and against Trump. And it's really hard to see kind of how is a top organization highlighted. On Facebook, it seems to be more so than Twitter. So what's interesting about that relating to trust in the source is that Trump has already sowed a lot of distrust in media sources. So what would be the actual source that has a reputable standing in correcting election fraud? Maybe some type of nonpartisan think tank, but then Trump has already kind of covered his bases there by saying that it's the deep state out to get him. So there's a lot of levels here in terms of that. And so I don't really know how effective those labels actually are.
Okay, and it's fair to say that so far there hasn't been enough time for there to be academic research on it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, another issue with academic research is if you're going to do some type of like experiment where you try to take these tweets and you try to show them to people, 2 or 3 months from now, will it have the same effect? Because it's not in the actual condition that it happened, right? So the research will probably look, and there has been research looking at like misinformation correction and fact-checking labels and these types of things. But in this particular context, it's going to be really hard to see what effect they had because we're in that context now. So the research would really have to be done already, basically.
This also begs sort of like a methodological question within academia. Are there any new methodologies being pioneered for social media research in particular because of how fast-paced it is, how transformative it is, and possibly old methods don't work as well? Absolutely.
There are an increasing number, particularly in the computational social science arena. What's interesting about a lot of these technologies is that they actually come from platforms themselves or tech companies themselves. So you see a lot of, or some emerging use of like computer vision. So I'm working on a project that labels the emotions that politicians express through their facial expressions. We're borrowing that technology from Amazon, who's already developed it. Or people are taking, to analyze text, they're taking models developed by Google or Facebook, and then sort of tweaking those for research purposes. So we see a lot of that. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in machine learning, which everyone is talking about. But there's a big difference between teaching a machine to detect the differences between cats and dogs in a picture and trying to, for example, learn what is the structure of arguments in social media text where there's lots of typos. And it's really hard for machines to pick up on that type of like deeper objective analysis. So yes, like we are working on the kind of computational methods to scale up our research a bit, but what I tend to find is that even with these like massive large data sets, you end up filtering out a lot of noise anyways and working with something that's quite manageable size-wise. It's social media comments particularly they're an absolute mess in terms of the things that you find there. So yeah, it's interesting.
So moving on to Parler quickly, this is something I would like to call the hot potato problem, which is that people, for instance, we suspend Trump on Twitter. He's no longer there. He must go somewhere else. So now Twitter can say it's not my problem. They've thrown the hot potato. Maybe they go to Parler. Parler has now been suspended from Apple Store, Google Play Store. Is this method a viable method of dealing with the fact that we have a lot of people who have these opinions and just pushing them off to successive new other platforms doesn't get rid of the problem?
No, it doesn't. And I think it speaks to a general issue about whether it's banning particular individuals or taking down certain posts. This is not a long-term fix by any means. And one of the interesting ways to look at this is, it seems like forever ago, but looking at how social media platforms shut down accounts related to ISIS. And there's some interesting research that basically argues that if you shut down a sort of ISIS supporter's account, they are more likely then to go and commit acts of terror because they feel like they're being silenced and they're aggravated, they lose their followers. And so they have this backfire effect where they actually then go out and commit terrorism. So there's probably some smaller scale examples of that. But yeah, the hot potato passing things around or blocking this and then something else pops up and stopping this and it pops up over here. It's definitely not sustainable in the long term, but it's also really hard to keep an account down. I mean, one of the things that these ISIS supporters were doing is that they'd have the same handle with different numbers. And as soon as one account got blocked, they would just pop up with a new number and everyone would refollow them. So that doesn't get to the alternative platforms question, but I think in terms of Parler, Gab, Minds, Mastodon, all of these sort of alternative platforms that people can go that offer less moderation and more quote unquote free speech. The problem with these platforms is that their features are severely underdeveloped. And that they're not actually, it's one thing to get an increase in users, and you'll hear these platforms talk about how many thousands of users they got since this person was banned or that person was banned. But that's a different thing than retaining users. And I think what people tend to find is that when they go on these platforms, the user experience is just not as good. And so they may sign up and create an account, but they're not particularly active a lot of the time. Parler was a little bit more successful because it had a lot of money backing it, I think from Robert Mercer. So it was able to build out like a decent user experience. But I mean, compared to Facebook or Twitter, these platforms are kind of broken in a sense. They don't offer much to the users, and you don't know if the people on there are particularly active. Basically, you need this kind of vibrant community, this network effects to get people to stay and come back to the platform. And in my experience, I've crawled around these platforms. They're not fun or interesting to from an experience and design standpoint.
Okay. So possibly it just makes it hard enough that they never gain momentum. So perhaps we move on to the 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh. After the 2016 election, you researched how platform design influences political communication strategy, and you interviewed Republican strategists about this. Watching the 2020 presidential elections unfold, were there any notable differences? Did you see that they learned a lot and adapted very well, or was it similar?
I think, if anything, 2020 was more of a continuation of 2016. 2016 was interesting to me because it was the first time you had platforms, particularly Instagram and Snapchat, that were kind of viable. Were they going to be used by political campaigns or not? And what those interviews basically showed is that one of the reasons Snapchat just didn't make it, just did not have a lot of investment, was that it could not deliver to campaigns the data that showed what their money was being used for. Was it effective or not? They couldn't even see how many people were viewing their stories because the platform was new. It hadn't been built out yet. So I think 2020 really revolved around particularly Facebook advertising because Twitter had banned it in response to all of the election interference controversies. And I think what 2018 was a testing ground to really see whether digital ads work. And we know of some super PACs that were running their own internal experiments showing that digital ads are effective for persuasion and mobilization. And I think 2020 was a bit more of the professionalization of that. So I would say that, if anything, 2020 was more about professionalizing Facebook advertising strategies, using more social science methods to see how you could optimize those, how you could actually make sure that the money you were investing was being effective somewhere. I think 2018 was a bit more of a experimental phase on that point. I mean, there was some certain best practices, but really 2020 was more about validating those practices, because also the 2018 midterms were a good test ground for that. So there was, I think that the midterms were seen as a way to start getting some more concrete evidence about what works and what doesn't. And then 2020 was a place to really put those strategies into practice and keep testing.
So in light of what happened a week ago, you've also conducted research on something that is called Scandalous Design, about how social media companies react to scandals when they unfold and what that can tell us about how they shape their own role as a political actor. Perhaps because this is so pertinent to what happened just a week ago, you could give a short summary of the conclusions of that research.
Yeah, so basically the idea is that a lot of the research and a lot of the sort of questions around social media and campaigns is, how is social media used by campaigns? You know, how is it the platform of delivery for an ad? And what that kind of does is it shields a bit the role that these companies play themselves. And if you actually sort of look at who these companies hire before elections, like notably hiring Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, to be in sort of Facebook's global policy or communications division. I mean, these are all strategic moves that try to build goodwill and rapport with governments. And so I was basically looking at the outcome of the controversies of Cambridge Analytica and Russian disinformation scandals, and noticing that platforms are making huge moves towards transparency, like with Facebook's ad library. We wouldn't have the ad library if there weren't these scandals to begin with. And so the basic argument was that companies have strategic levers they can pull, both in terms of building out their products, but also in terms of shaping the design of their organizations and their internal policies around content moderation, for example. And these, as we talked about earlier, these decisions, the implementations of different policies and features, come in response a lot of times to scandal. And so that's the idea, is basically trying to isolate what are those features and policies that come in response to scandal, and what does that tell us about how platforms strategically position themselves, both as products in terms of making sure that they are kind of skirting the will to be regulated, but also how are they actively lobbying governments, basically through their different mechanisms that they have in terms of who they hire and sort of what the public and media attention is around them.
So would it be correct to assume that social media companies generally do only transform or change when pressured to do so, especially in political? Obviously, they introduce new features that might increase their user base and so on. But when it comes to political issues, they tend to only act if in a corner and when scandals happen.
I think that's when you see big kind of public initiatives like this Facebook Oversight Board, for example. But I wouldn't say that it's only in response to that. I think they have very powerful lobby organizations, like filled with lawyers. I forget the exact name, but one is called the CCIA. And you know, they're based in Washington, and they're doing a lot of lobbying for tech companies. I mean, these companies are highly strategic actors. I think that's the point. It's not that they're just platforms that just pass content along. They sort of know what they're doing. And going back to what we talked about in terms of banning Trump ahead of a new Biden administration, in a sense that's responsive, but it's also showing foresight as well. The problem is that platforms, we don't realize it when we look at our phones, but we're getting updates to platforms, sometimes hundreds or thousands a day, that are being shipped, different products, different features on the back end in terms of the algorithms and how they work. They're being tweaked, bugs are being fixed. So we look at this graphical user interface, you know, what we see on our phones, and we see a sort of stable product, but on the back end, it's highly fluid and being changed all the time. So it's really hard to see what's happening, how are changes being tweaked, but we can use these responses to scandal as a way to see what are the kind of big changes that they're making, and what are they signaling by doing those changes. They say, for example, or Facebook says it's transparency, but there's a lot of critique of how this ad archive works that isn't really quite transparent. So it's an open question, but I think it's one that's interesting to follow.
Very much so. And perhaps a last question. Do you think what are the most positive things that have come from the fact that everyone has a voice now using social media? We tend to usually talk about disinformation and cyberbullying, the negative effects, perhaps to end on a uptone, if there are any. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I really think there are. I think if you take the net gain or the net contribution of social media, I think it's ultimately a positive. And there's been a really, really interesting switch where back in 2010-ish, social media was seen as, harbinging in the promotion of democracy and authoritarian regimes with the Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really only recently that we've had this switch to social media being these sort of terrible democracy corrupting companies. But I think whether it's used for good or bad, I mean, and you can, being apolitical here, but you can look at the protests with Black Lives Matter movement, and you can look at the protests at the Capitol building. And you can see that what unites these two is that social media is used as a way both to organize, but also to report live from the field and share videos around on social media. And so I think the number one change that social media has brought in terms of expression and politics is being able to organize quickly in response to certain events, or basically just being able to overcome classic collective action problems, and basically turn online participation into on the streets activism. And we've seen this upend authoritarian regimes. We've seen this be used to promote essentially insurrection at the Capitol. One you could argue is good, one you can argue is bad, but I think overall, the ability for citizens to connect quickly and air their grievances is kind of sort of the biggest political transformation that social media has brought. And I think overall, it depends how it's used, but the act of being able to quickly come together and express grievances is overall positive.
Well, there we go. We have a positive ending. So Michael also hosts the podcast Social Media and Politics, which I wholeheartedly recommend. And thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was fun.